or to be successful. I kind of gave you the first one. First thing is you have to survive. And then what do you need to do?
Reproduce.
All right, that's kind of step 3. So reproduce. What do you need to do between surviving and reproducing?
Eat.
You need to eat, which allows you to put on
Weight.
mass, right? So you have to grow. You have to grow into the adult size. And so that's the 3 things that we have to be able to do. We have to be able to survive, grow, and reproduce. And as we go through the day, we're going to be talking about different environments and how in some environments it might just have enough resources that the organisms are only able to survive, but they're not really able to put on mass and they're not able to reproduce. We might have an environment that's a little bit better where they're able to survive and put on mass, but for whatever reason they don't have enough excess energy to reproduce. And then of course ultimately your more ideal habitats, they should be able to do all 3. They should be able to survive, grow, and reproduce. So it is a little bit of a sequence there in terms of this particular list. All right, our next definition is adaptation, because we'll use that term here and there throughout the semester. We talk about an animal being adapted to an environment. What exactly does that mean? And so as you're looking at this definition, I'm going to read it so we can go over the different parts. There's a lot of information in it. And so just to read it right off the top, it's any heritable, behavioral, morphological, or physiological trait that maintains or increases the fitness of an organism in a given environment. All right, so let's tackle the first part. Heritable means
Be passed down.
yeah, you got some genes, and so there's a gene that controls that trait, and you can pass it down to the next generation. Hopefully at some time in your career you're probably exposed to Darwin's finches, and they talked about finch beak depth. You have to say it slowly, it's hard to say. Finch beak depth. And one of the things that's significant about that research is they were able to tie specific genes associated with beak depth. Not just the depth itself, and then it was different between birds. But it had a genetic component so that if you had a thick bill, your offspring were also going to have a thick bill for the most part. All right, behavioral. I think when I think behavioral, because of just my interests and bias, the first thing I think is breeding dances and stuff, and that certainly would fall into this category. But really, this is more talking about adaptive behaviors. And so if you are a salamander on a hot, sunny day, are you sitting out in the field, in the sun, basking? No, where are you? Yeah, so they have a drive, a behavior that has them seek dark, moist environments, right? So it's those types of adaptive behaviors that are adaptations to help them survive in their environment. That's kind of what they're really referring to here. Morphological, that's form. Morphological, you generally would associate with anatomy. Function is physiological, which is the next one. And so since I was reading about fishes all day yesterday for the biology of vertebrates class, many of their fins, the ones where they have single fins in particular, those are for stability in the water, right? And so the size and shape of those fins are important. That would be their morphology, and that's why different fishes living in different fish environments have fins with different morphologies. Right? And then physiological is, like I said, the function. So A and P, anatomy is your form, physiology is your function. We'll talk about some physiology in particular as we go through here. We're going to talk about heat environments and water management. And so there is an animal, and I'll show you a picture of it when we actually get to this section, called an oryx, which is an ungulate. You've probably seen pictures before. It's got the big horns. They're like big semicircles, backwards. And they're in a very hot environment. One of the things they'll do is they'll allow their bodies to go hyperthermic. So what is hyperthermic?
Really hot.
Yeah, warmer than their average body temperature, essentially, right? And by doing that, that alleviates some of their energetic need in cooling their bodies because they've allowed themselves to go a little bit warmer. So for us on a hot day, we still need to maintain at approximately, what's ours?
98.6.
37 degrees Celsius, because we're scientists, right? Yeah, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if it's 80 degrees outside, that's pretty good. We don't have to do a lot of maintaining our body temperature. It's not too far off. We have that fact that feels kind of pleasant. We don't have to worry about, getting rid of excess heat. If it's 102 outside, then you have to sweat, which costs energy. get all grumpy, that also costs energy. All of those things associated with it. And so basically what this is saying is if you're set at 98.6 and it's 102, what the oryxes do is they would raise their body temperature to like 100 and 101 so that the difference isn't as big, essentially. All right. So the next part of this, so that's what they're talking about. So all of the adaptations that help that animal live in their environment successfully in order to survive, grow, and reproduce. That's what the first part is about. And then it uses the term fitness. Does this mean going to the gym? What is fitness? So it's your genetic contribution to the next generation, right? So that's how much of your genome you pass on into the gene pool after you're gone. It sounds like only one of us is doing that. So biologically not that successful. And so it can be kind of interesting. I think I'm trying to think we do it in this class. I teach too many different classes now. We might not. It might be in ornithology I talk about it. Anyway, you don't have to necessarily have your own offspring, right? And sexually reproducing organisms, that's the most efficient way to pass on your genes. That's what I mean by that is you're going to pass along your highest percentage, right? 50% of your genes would be passed on through your offspring. But I could also help raise my siblings' offspring. And by doing that, I would also be perpetuating some of my genome, a smaller fraction, but some of my genome to the next generation. Bad news, my sibling also doesn't have any offspring. Our line is done. And neither one of us ever wanted it, per se. So, and if you take a behavioral ecology class, you would learn, and I don't remember the percentages because I took my behavioral ecology class a really long time ago, but it's 50% if it's an offspring. I think it goes down to a quarter if it's a sibling. But you could also save a whole bunch of your cousins and be passing on some of your genome as well, right? But you would have to save like 2 siblings to equal 1 child, that kind of thing. So there was a whole section we did. It's called kin selection. All right, so fitness is your contribution to the next generation. Most logically, that's generally referring to your own offspring, but not necessarily. Because there are some species that do have helpers, for example, where they have a communal system. And then the question would be, why would you help? And the answer, partially, in some cases anyway, is you are helping individuals that are related to you. Right? All right, that gives us real quick to natural selection. I've got a super short definition. Would not be acceptable in evolutionary biology, I suspect. Or maybe even freshman biology. But I just have differential reproductive success. There's a lot kind of summed up in there, but basically what it means is some individuals survive and some don't, and it is the survivors that get to reproduce. And so the assumption here under natural selection is that the ones that are survive have the adaptations that give them some type of advantage in that particular habitat. And so this is called natural selection because it is adaptation to the environment in which they're living. I think briefly we will also talk at some point about sexual selection. And sexual selection are for traits that will increase your chances of finding a mate and reproducing. Right, so that's a different type of situation. Probably mostly review on this slide, but do we have any questions? Need it all fresh in our heads before we go forward today? Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 laws. The first one's going to be Liebig's law. And these 3 laws all deal with physiological ecology and organismal ecology, and they're going to build upon one another. And the second law we're going to discuss is going to be called the law of limiting factors. And I'm bringing that up because the term limiting factors is used very loosely in ecology, and we need to be more specific today in our use of it. I'm going to try really hard to do so. So as I shared with you on Monday, I also have a background in natural resources management. So when I hear limiting factors, I tend to think of what's limiting the population. But as we go into the law of limiting factors, what we're going to find is it actually is a specific set of factors, if we want to be specific in ecology. Overall, either one of those definitions is going to be useful, right? So if you're in NRM, if you don't have to change the way you think of it per se, But in order to understand these three laws, we need to loosen it up and be more specific. Does that make sense? Okay. And I'm bringing it up now because Liebig's law of the minimum is probably how, especially if you come from an NRM background, you think about limiting factors. And we want to be very careful and not use that terminology as we're talking about Liebig's law. Okay? And so Liebig's law of the minimum says the resource in shortest supply will impact your ability to survive, grow, and reproduce. So that's where those three things come into handy. Right? We're eventually gonna do a little graph kind of looking at that. Survive, grow, and reproduce. Okay? The key to this definition that's gonna help us move forward with these three laws that we're gonna be looking at is this is the resource in shortest supply. Okay? And so the way I learned it, and it still makes the most sense to me today, is you get one of those old-timey rain barrels, the one that's made up of slats with the metal rings. What's nice is we like to use them as planters now, so usually most of you are still familiar with them. If all of the slats in the rain barrel are the same length, then you can fill that rain barrel up to the top, right? You can put as many organisms in there as the environment will support. What happens if I go in and I cut one of the slats in half? How far can I fill up the bucket now? Halfway, right? And so that slat that I cut becomes the minimum in this particular case. See, I was very careful. I wanted to say limiting factor, but we don't want to do that, right? So it becomes what is the restriction on how many organisms that environment can hold, essentially. So I do a lot of work. My favorite group of birds is the woodpeckers. Woodpeckers need snags and dead trees in order to make cavities. And so for them, one of the factors that can control how large the population size of woodpeckers in an area can be is the number of available snags and trees. Right? Now, as we look at restrictions on Liebig's law, it assumes and that one resource is going to be in short supply at a time. All right? And so this is a good time to note, again, that we're doing theoretical ecology in this class. And often these, even though we may not always do it, most of the time we're not going to do it, they're usually based on mathematical models. And so as you're building mathematical models, it's a lot simpler to build a model in which one factor is a problem rather than 10 factors are being a problem, right? And so you'll see a lot of these types of things. However, in reality, when you're looking at an environment, it's probably going to be several factors are going to come into play, not just one. And so if you go back to our rain barrel, what you would see is instead of all of them being the same height except the one I cut, they're all going to be of various heights, right? And those various heights are going to change. So like right now, maybe in July, we were actually fairly moist for July. And so water slat was maybe all the way to the top. And now what's happened to our water slat? Way low, right? When I walk across the grass and barefooted, it's like crunch and little poofs of dust. I haven't mowed my yard in like 4 weeks. It's crazy, right? And then what's going to happen when it rains? Then it's going to come back up, right? And so these slats are going to be changing as environmental factors change, which is kind of what this is saying. And so as one resource becomes abundant, then another one is still going to be what's limiting the population size. And that's why limiting factors is used so freely, because in all three of these, that's what we're doing, is we're figuring out how many organisms the environment can support, essentially. And it can only support as much as that factor that is least abundant. All right, any questions about Liebig's law of the minimum? All right. The next up is the law of limiting factors. And since Liebig's law dealt with a minimum, the law of limiting factors actually deals with having too much of something. That's why we have to be a little bit more careful and expand kind of how we think about limiting factors. And so a resource can be so abundant that it becomes a limiting factor. In other words, it can impact an organism's ability to survive, grow, and reproduce. So for example, I just talked about us being in near drought conditions. I got a message from the Latham-Duketon Fire Department. I'm in that area. I'm not in Martin. That we're not supposed to be burning anything right now. However, in the spring, we had like rain and then more rain and then rain and then even more rain. And then we had like 5 inches in one day in Memorial Day. I don't know if y'all remember that. That was so long ago. And so all of that water at that point became a limiting factor because everything was saturated, right? And so if you think about an earthworm, is an earthworm very happy when our soil becomes saturated? No, because they can't breathe. What do? They come up to the top and then they get on the sidewalks, and then what do y'all do?
Step on them probably.
Nobody's a mover in here? Nobody moves them off the sidewalk?
I do. Only sometimes.
A lot of them end up smushed on campus, yeah.
Usually by the time I find them, they're all crispy
I'll pick them up, like especially if there's one that's big, gets my attention, it's wiggling a lot. I'll pick it up and I'll try to find a place that isn't so like a puddle, because it probably came out of where there was standing water for the most part. They can't survive that very well. Going back to Liebig's law of momentum, what are the earthworms doing right now?
Going deeper.
They are deeper, and then they curl up into little balls. If you dig them up right now, they'll be in little balls trying to conserve their moisture. It's kind of interesting. They probably slime around it, but I'm not sure past that. I've dug them up and seen them in their little balls, though. I'm not an earthworm biologist. All right. So both Liebig's law of the minimum and the law of limiting factors focus on resources that are controlling the organism's ability to survive, grow, and reproduce, but they are opposite ends of the spectrum. Right? So Liebig's law of the minimum is what is in least supply that's causing the population to be restrained or causing the organism problems. The limiting factors is the upper end, moisture, temperature, any variety of things. If there's too many, that can be a problem. And in reality, organisms are going to live somewhere on that gradient, right? And so what we really need to do is to put those two laws together, and that's what we do to get the third and final law, which is the law of tolerance. Fancy. These actually dry erase. So I've got an example of it right here, and I'm going to just draw it along with you so that I try to emphasize to you this is important. I might ask you to draw something similar on the exam, so I don't have to read so much. I'm a very visual learner myself. And so essentially what we're doing on this graph is we're going to have some type of environmental gradient. Okay? And we're going to go from a low number to a high number. I'm being specific there because my freshmen, especially my non-majors class, they don't all get that. Like this summer, I would get a graph where, it'd be like 190 and 0 would be up here. I don't know where that slipped through the cracks, but I thought it was kind of weird. And so I had to explain that 0's in the corner, 0 up and 0 out. Right? So we're going to go from low to high. And so if we're interested in moisture, this would be a dry environment, this would be a wet environment. We're talking about temperature, this would be cold. I just hit the button, didn't I? Yep. Oh, I hit the freeze button. This would be cold, this would be hot. We're talking about salinity, low salinity, high salinity. If we're talking about altitude, like mountainous ranges, low altitude, high altitude. So any type of environmental gradient that we want to deal with. And then along the other axis, we're looking at performance. Okay, and performance can be a variety of things. And so if we want to go back to the simple experiment where we grow earthworms in dry soil, moist soil, and supersaturated soil, then what performance, in order to see how well they're performing in that environment, maybe we want to measure how fast they're growing. And so every week we dig up the earthworms, we measure them and record that, right? And so maybe it's length. For birds, a lot of times we'll do reproduction because we can find the nest, so we'll count the eggs, how many eggs hatch, how many of those fledge, that type of thing. So we're actually measuring directly reproduction as performance. Fish, they often do length again, length and width, so types of measurement. So anything that tells you whether the organism is surviving, growing, or reproducing. Okay, that's going to be your measure of performance that's referring to. All right. For any particular factor, you're going to end up with a bell-shaped curve. Okay, it's also a normal curve, not a paranormal curve like I had the other day. And at the peak of this curve, this is basically their optimum along the scale, whatever it happens to be. So the earthworm, their optimum moisture, wherever it is on the scale, that's where you would tend to find the most success, the best growing earthworms. However, I didn't mark that because in reality there's a range that's going to be more or less optimal for them. And so that range is going to get kind of your peak of your curve. Let's see if we can bring in some colors here. And I'll start with black since I've already got it. And so during this range, and I'm shading it right now, this whole area, which would represent this part of our curve, whatever that happens to, of our gradient, right? Whatever that happens to be, this particular moisture range, this is where they are able to survive, grow, and reproduce. They can do all three. And see over here, they've got it labeled as reproduction, which is assuming they're doing the other two, right? So they can survive there, they can grow there, put on mass, and then they are getting enough excess energy past that they're able to reproduce. Then on either side of that curve, you've got another area, which I'm going to put in red this time. And again, it's going to represent this part, whatever this part of the scale is. That's the range we're talking about. And in this part, they're only able to grow and survive. I guess it should have S on top. There we go. They can survive and they can grow, but they aren't able to get enough resources to invest in reproduction. Depending on your pathway to this class, what classes you've had before, in other words, you may have heard the term sources and sinks referring to environments. Right? Some of you shaking your heads. We will also specifically talk about them later this semester. But a source is like your optimal habitat, where you're producing a surplus of animals, so you're producing more than the environment can support, and therefore it's called a source because the surplus animals move out and populate other areas, essentially. And so this would essentially be your source. And then these are what we would call a sink. And a sink is where they're able to survive, and it can even have high numbers. Like if you just went out in the census, it would look like good habitat because you could have many individuals in it. But if you look more closely, they're not successfully reproducing. And if they're not successfully reproducing, if you take away this habitat, these will disappear. Okay? And we'll talk more about that at length, but just to plant some seeds for later. All right, and then finally, you got it out there already, but during the tails, I'll just do those up in blue. You do have an area out there where they're able to survive, and that's about it. Again, it's the link here of the scale. That's what the resource actually represents. This would still be considered a sink, but we're talking about a pretty serious sink at that point. It's all they can do is survive. And then what you get outside of this, which I'm not going to draw on there, but they do have it on this graph, then they're not able to survive. So this is the unacceptable habitat, right? They're not able to occur in those areas. So they can only occur along this part of the gradient, and this part of the gradient is where you're actually doing the best. Any questions about my beautiful drawing so far? Yes?
You said you may ask us to draw this on a test. Would you want the absent areas as well?
These, no. I kind of like that they're on there, but yeah, there's no reason to draw this. I want to know where they can survive, grow, and reproduce. Good questions. Anything else? All right. Well, I just drew a big wide curve because, I'm just trying to teach you what it looks like. But in reality, I could have a curve that's very narrow, like that, right? Ooh. That means they're very specific about their habitat requirement. Or I could have one that's like just ridiculously broad. It went like way up under there. I went like all the way to the other side. No, I didn't go that far. So I put in a slide on the next one, where it talks about degree of tolerance a little bit. And so this is another one where it kind of depends on your pathway to this class. So I don't really talk about steno and uri in ornithology, but they do in ick because of salinity. So they talk about uri-haline and steno-haline, I believe, and things like that. So you may or may not have run into these, but steno generally means an organism that has narrow tolerance for a particular environmental factor, and uri means that they have a wide tolerance for an environmental factor. And so this one would be steno, and this one would be uri. And then I'll just give you a few examples. And so, like I mentioned, the fish, they'll talk about steno-haline and uri-haline. And so steno-haline would be a fish that is very specific about the salinity that it grows in. And so that typically is going to be a freshwater fish or a true saltwater fish. I'm being on the extreme sides. Whereas uri-haline, they can use a broad range of salinity, and that's usually going to be your estuarine fishes. And so an estuary is where the fresh water runs into the ocean, and so you have a gradient there that goes from freshwater to saltwater. And so the fishes that live there need to be able to tolerate when there's a flood and you get extra salt water or fresh water, or if there's a drought and you get more salt water, they need to be able to survive those varying salinity conditions. Right? And then you got some other ones like stenothermal versus eurythermal, talking about temperature ranges. I guess I should use these when we talk about the earthworm example, right? Whether it's stenohydric or euryhydric and so forth. So mostly just getting you familiar with steno versus uri. And the idea that their tolerance for different factors can be different. Once we get through talking about carbon and light and temperatures and water, I think, then I'm going to talk to you extensively about niches. Good luck to y'all. That's what I did my PhD in. I'm just kidding. We'll spend a couple of days on it though. And one of my goals as we talk about niches in this class is to expand how you think about it. Because the reality is a niche refers to all of the different things that impacts an organism. And so an organism might be uri for one thing, one factor in its environment, and steno for a different one. Right? So just trying to start to plant some seeds again. So we'll talk about red-cockaded woodpeckers as an example of an endangered species. They actually, well, if you want to use theirs, they are uriaceous. They actually use a broad range of habitat. They'll forage for food in pine forest, but also they'll use hardwood forest, and so they're not that particular as long as they can find insects and grubs and things. However, when it comes to nesting, they need a pine tree that has a particular fungus infection, has a particular diameter. In other words, they're extremely specific about the tree that they'll use for nesting. And so they become an endangered species because that tree, that specific factor becomes under threat. Right? It's not because of what they eat. A lot of times that's your general ecology examples would be raccoon versus something like a koala, right? And so I want to broaden us to start to think about niches a little bit more about the different factors they might be using. All right, any questions about that so far? So one factor at a time, essentially. The other thing we want to think about is the tolerance is not always fixed. It's not fixed. All right. And so here we have where you have a shift between seasons. That's what this is particularly showing you. And so again, we have an environmental gradient versus performance. So the same thing we have over here on the side. And the example we'll have here is, let's think about fish again. We're fish heavy today for some reason. And so if I go out and I measure the temperature in Pacer Pond right now, is it going to be warm or cold? Pacer Pond is shallow. And so my guess is if you put your hand in it, it's going to feel like bathtub water. It's going to feel warm, right? And you're going to have bluegill and bass and things like that living in there. And then in the winter, if you go out and put your hand in it, it's going to be cold. And so that means all the bluegill and bass and things are gone, right? No, it means that they've shifted their environmental tolerance. Okay? This type of shift that's based on seasons is called acclimatization. Acclimatization. And it is a response to a natural change in the environment, in this case changing from fall to winter, or summer to winter temperatures. It's usually gradual, giving them the opportunity to do that. Because I don't think you can do this anymore. Well, we used to be able to go to Walmart and buy a fish, right? And they put it in a little bag, and then you took it home and you just threw that fish directly into your tank, right? No, you floated the bag with the fish in it until they were supposedly the same temperature, and then you let the fish go, right? So you wouldn't have any shock. And so if you think about this here, if I took one of our fishes right now and I brought it into the lab and I kept it in an aquarium that is the temperature that Pacer Pond is right now, and then I took it out into Pacer Pond and threw it into the water in December, what's it going to do? It's going to die. Okay. All right. So acclimatization is a natural change. What I was just talking about in terms of buying a fish and letting it float in your aquarium, that's actually acclimation. And you tend to see acclimation more often because you're going to say you acclimated them to the lab, essentially. Because it's a lot harder to control what's happening in the natural environment. And so what I could do is I could go out to Pacer Pond and get a fish, and then I could start gradually dropping the temperature in the tank, and I can bring it into its winter adaptation or tolerance to winter temperatures in the lab, even though it's still warm outside, right? So that would be an artificial change to the way it's interacting with its environment, and that's where you get acclimation. And so most of the time when you're picking up papers, they're using it correctly because what they're doing is they're bringing the organisms into a lab setting, giving them time to adjust to that lab setting, and then doing their experiment, right? So that's acclimation. In this slide, what I really want us to think about is the more natural changes that happen, and the natural changes are acclimatization. All right. Any questions about any of that? Okay. So I'm going to take a minute and do some background again. So depending on who you had for freshman biology, you probably were exposed to this. I do it pretty heavy with my freshmen because it's something that they see a lot, especially if you take anatomy and physiology classes going forward. So I try to give them a good foundation. I do have some unfortunate background in human anatomy and physiology. When I first came to UTM, I was teaching the zoology 251 and 352. I was miserable. I didn't like it so much. And I don't do it anymore. I haven't had to in a long time. So now I teach bird anatomy and physiology. Frankly, I still am not crazy about anatomy and physiology, but it's still better than human anatomy and physiology. All right? But because of that, the examples I'm going to use here will be mostly human. That's what I'm getting at. All right. So we want to talk about this idea of homeostasis, which is your ability to maintain internal stability, which is fun to say. Ability to maintain your internal stability. However, even though I will likely use a lot of human physiology examples, also because you can relate to them for the most part, we could apply this to the health of an ecosystem, right? A forest. Is this forest in homeostasis or is something out of whack, essentially? And so this is a term that we can use quite a lot. We can also refer to homeostasis as a dynamic equilibrium, like you see there in the parentheses. And so equilibrium means that you have a set point. Dynamic means that you're ever changing. Okay? In other words, your ability to maintain internal stability doesn't mean that you set your body temperature at 98.6 and it's always 98.6. In fact, if we go around the room and check your normal temperatures, you're probably not all normally at 98.6. I'm not. I'm lower by quite a bit on average. But rather, you're going to go up and down around that, right, 98.6 if we stay with that as our baseline. So for example, if you're exercising, you're going to run a little hot. If it's a cold day and you're walking across the quad, you might be running a little bit cold, that kind of thing. If you are sitting around watching TV, you're probably fairly flat. You fall asleep watching TV, you're probably going to dip, that type of thing. If you're perimenopausal or menopausal, you're probably going to spike. But that's for different reasons. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about homeostasis. And I've got some general terms referring to how things work. And so receptors are whatever is sensing change in the environment. So we're going to stay mostly with the human body. And so you have lots of touch type receptors and heat receptors in your hands, and so if you put it on something hot or something cold, you're able to detect that. Your blood vessels, they have stretch receptors, and so if your blood pressure goes up, it's going to push what that actually is the blood pushing against the walls of your vessels, and it's going to cause them to stretch, and so you have stretch receptors that are going to be monitoring your blood pressure and so forth, right? So you have the receptors. They're going to take that information and report it to the integrating center. And we're going to call it the integrating center because it's not necessarily your brain. It kind of depends on what the particular situation it is and how urgent it is. And so most of it is still going to be your brain and spinal cord, but you also have some nerve ganglia out in your body that can make certain decisions as well. So it's not always your central nervous system. So for example, if you put your hand down on a hot stove, you don't really want to spend the time, even though it's not much time, to send that signal all the way to your brain to make a decision and back. That's going to go through your spinal cord and immediately cause you to move your hand more quickly by fractions of a second than if it went all the way to your brain. Okay? So integrating center is what's going to process that information and decide if you need to respond. And that's going to happen much more rapidly than it took for me to say that. All right, and then you have the effectors. And the effectors are whatever carries out the orders from the integrating center. And so in the case of putting my hand on a hot stove, what's going to happen is the integrating center is going to come up with a plan. It's going to decide which muscles need to contract. And then the muscles that contract and move your hand, those are the effectors. All right. In the case of high blood pressure, if the integrating center decides that you need to lower your blood pressure, then it's going to send out a signal to your vessels, and they are the effectors. They're the ones that are going to alter their diameter, and by doing that will alter your blood pressure. Okay? Everybody following along? Okay. So there's two types of feedback that allow a system to maintain homeostasis. And again, this could be a physiological system like we're talking about, but it could be an ecosystem as well. And so you can have negative feedbacks. And so in a negative feedback, you start to change, and then you're going to kick in some effectors, and you're going to act to correct that change and bring it back to our equilibrium. Most of the time, that's what we want. So if your blood pressure is getting out of whack, you want to bring it back to your equilibrium. Your body temperature is getting out of whack, you want to bring it back to your equilibrium. And so generally, if you're functioning properly in most situations, this is what's happening, negative feedbacks. Even though it sounds bad because it says negative. All right. The other thing we can have is a positive feedback. And in this case, you're going to sense a change, and you're going to continue changing. Okay, so you're going to be moving away from equilibrium, and you're going to continue to move away from equilibrium. There are situations in which that is important. We'll talk about birth and babies, and we're going to talk about blood clotting when we get to that. So there are some reasons why you do need a few positive feedbacks. But if you ever watch any of the doctor shows like ER or Grey's Anatomy or things like that, if you bring somebody into an emergency room and they're saying that person is decompensating, what that means is they've gotten into a deadly series of positive feedbacks. That's what that actually means. Yeah.
Can you take like one step to your right, please?
No.
Okay, that works too.
When I was in school, we had, I don't know if they even do this anymore, but we had a lesson in PE on square dancing. Did you have to do that? I really liked square dancing. And then when I was an adult, I went to a 4th of July barn party and got to use my skills and do some square dancing. It was fun. But I always had trouble, I still have trouble with left and right. And so they took a big black marker and they put L's and R's on my hand. I bet that part they probably can't do anymore. But it was helpful. But I know how to do-si-do. All right. So, to get this started, we're going to look at a simplified example of body temperature in humans. Okay. Before I get this started, the reason I'm saying this is simplified is because your body temperature is never going to be a smooth curve, right? So if I said, all right, it's a 3-day weekend, we don't have class on Monday, woo! However, I want you to do a homework assignment. And I want you to take your body temperature every 30 minutes for the 3 days that we are out of school. You know, it would all kill me, right? But if you actually did that, what are you going to find? You're going to find if you're not exercising, it's kind of fluctuating up and down here. You're exercising, it's going to move around, right? But it's never going to be a smooth line like this, which is the point. And we're not going to do that experiment, of course. All right. So just kind of keep that in mind. But this is trying to help us think about how negative feedbacks work. Okay. And so, like I said, our body temperature is 37°C, at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this is our set point. And by the way, your thermostat in your house works the same way. So if you set your thermostat at 78, that doesn't mean it maintains 78 all the time. It has a range, and how expensive your air conditioning unit is probably going to determine somewhat what that range is. And so if you don't have a very expensive air conditioning unit, you might get quite warm before it kicks on, and then you might get cold before it kicks back off. And that's because its range is pretty wide. If you're in something like Walmart, something industrial where they want you to be happy, then they're going to have a narrower range on which it kicks off and on. If it's really high, it makes me cold, that kind of thing. So, so that's what you're kind of seeing here. So our set point, this is what we're putting our thermostat on, is 98.6. Our upper limit of healthy is 99.5. So reaching 99.5 is not a big deal. That's normal. You likely do it every time you exercise. Some of the young men, in particular men, tend to run a little bit hotter than women. You might even run at 99 as a normal temperature. Right? So 99 is no big deal. This is why if you're 99.5, you're still going to school. Right? You're not going to trick your parents into being sick. All right, down here is our normal lower end, 97.7. And I run somewhere around 98. And so it's not uncommon for me to be around 97 personally. That's not uncommon for women. Women do tend to run a little bit cooler than men. Okay? So we already see there's a lot of variation there. So here we go. And so I'm just sitting around. I got up in the morning, I fixed my breakfast, and now that's not really going to impact my body temperature all that much. I mean, it's not going to stay exactly. It's going to be constantly adjusting, but it's going along. And then I think, oh, it's a beautiful day. It's going to be 100 degrees. I think I'll jog to work. And so here I go. I put on my sneakers and I take off running, and my body temperature begins to increase. So now I'm moving away from my set point. Right? If I continue to do that, that can be very dangerous. That would also be a positive feedback, which we'll come back to. And so my body is going to start to take action. It's going to do a couple of things. What's the first, most obvious thing it's going to do?
Sweat.
I'm going to sweat. And so what is sweating going to do for me?
Cool you off
How?
by the water evaporating on your skin.
Okay. And so water has different states, right? Solid, liquid, and gas. And in order to move between those different states, it requires energy. And so if you put liquid water on the surface of your body, then the energy that it takes for it to go from liquid to a gas, it's what's removed from you. So that's pretty cool if you really think about it. You're basically boiling the water off of you. That's what you're really doing. And so as that water boils off of you, that heat is removed from your body. Yeah. So what's the problem with high humidity?
It can't evaporate.
Yeah, it can't evaporate as easily. So last week I taught all summer, all 10 weeks. And so last week I'm out. So I wasn't here for any of the freshman stuff. I went to Arkansas and I did some hiking, and it was dry and there was zero humidity. And so what was happening to my sweat? It was evaporating rapidly. And I had a hydration pack on, and I sucked the crap out of that thing. It was dry by the time I got to the end of the hike. Right? All right, so that's how that works. So what do you think the word vasodilation is? We got sweating, it's up there. But what is vasodilation?
Or like blood vessels opening up.
Yeah, so dilation means it's going to widen,
Yeah.
and vaso is your vascular tissue. So your blood vessels are going to widen. And so is that referring to all of the blood vessels in your body?
Probably just some of them.
If all the blood vessels in your body suddenly vasodilated, you'd pass out. You might die, but in particular you would pass out in this particular case because your blood pressure would plummet. So this is a targeted response. And what you're going to do is you're going to dilate the blood vessels in your extremities. And so like your fingers, your toes, your face, your ears, tops of your thighs. And the way you would interpret that is if you look at somebody who's hot, they're going to be red, right? And so what you're doing is you're pumping more blood from your core out to your extremities where you have more surface area, and you can expel excess heat by doing that. All right, so that's what it means by vasodilation. You're not dilating everything. You're not going to dilate the vessels around your heart, for example. Okay. All right. Now, the other thing that's kind of a problem with this diagram is as long as you are exercising between vasodilation and sweating, and I'm sure there's some other mechanisms that kick in, what it should do is keep you from going into critical heat range, right? But you're going to stay up there as long as you're exercising. You don't just get up there and then suddenly sweat and you cool off, right? You're going to stay warm as long as you're exercising. So that's a little misleading here in this diagram. But let's say I ran to my mailbox and I was like, yeah, this is stupid. For one thing, I live 20 minutes from campus, so it's not the smartest thing for me to do. And so I go back home, I take a shower because I got really sweaty. And as I'm showering and I'm not running anymore and I'm sweating and vasodilating is going to help me get rid of my excess heat, I should come back down to normal, right? This part right here, this is a single negative feedback. We sensed a problem and we corrected that problem back to the baseline. Okay. This particular diagram has another negative feedback on it, the blue line, of course. I don't know what y'all do to make your way through college, but I used to work at E.W. James in Hornwall, Tennessee. That was my first job, first real job. And in the summer, when I was a cashier, but when it got really slow, sometimes I would stock shelves and sometimes I'd go back to the freezer, and that was one of our hiding places. And so I get back there in the freezer, and I'd sit back there for a while, but I couldn't sit back there too long because as soon as I got in there, what's going to happen to body temperature? Yeah, at first it's going to feel really good because, it's the South in the summer. But eventually you get really cold and you begin shivering. So what exactly is shivering?
You're like rapidly moving, so it
Okay,
generates
that's the effect of it. What are you actually doing when you're shivering?
Intense muscle spasms.
Yeah, your muscles are spasming. They are burning energy, and as a result of burning energy, they are releasing heat, right? So just like in the winter, if you turn on the engine of your car to warm it up, as the engine begins burning gasoline, it's going to turn that gasoline into heat, essentially, right? And so in your muscles, you have something called glycogen, which is a sugar that sits there. That's the fuel. And so the muscles begin to break down that glycogen, and that's where that heat comes from. Okay, so that's shivering. And then you're going to do vasoconstriction. And so are you going to constrict all your blood vessels at the same time? All right, in this case, it actually would kill you because your aorta would just go and you would be dead. And so no, that's not what you're doing. Your aorta is already pretty sensitive to high blood pressure. Instead, again, this is targeted. And what we're going to do is we're going to constrict the blood vessels in your extremities, your hands, your ears, tops of your ears, your nose, your cheeks, tops of your thighs, that type of thing. And while you're outside, you're going to look paler. If you get cold enough, your lips will be blue, right? Because you are diverting your blood to your core to try to retain as much heat as possible. You're going to circulate that blood around your vital organs, and you're going to completely bypass capillary beds in your extremities. At first, this is not a big deal. It's an adaptation to get you through a short bit of cold. But after a while, those tissues, like at the tips of your fingers and nose, they become oxygen deprived, and metabolic waste begins to build up. And that tissue is not getting any warming blood into them, and so eventually that tissue will begin to die and freeze, and that's referred to as
hyperthermia.
Frostbite. Yeah, that's frostbite. Yeah, frostbite. But I'm not going to stay in there long enough for that. Besides, I'm supposed to be being a cashier, so I can't stay in there for too long. I just go in there and cool off. And so I come out of the cooler, and as I go back to working, I'm moving around. I've got, shivering and vasoconstriction also going to help me. Eventually, I'll come back to my set point, and this would also be a single negative feedback. Now, the way this graph is set up, this is ridiculous, right? This would be like intense exercise freezing, and that's not what happens in reality. Okay, you could make yourself really, really seriously ill if you did that. Okay, we are at 9, so let's take a quick break. I also think I want to download a slide.